everybody. Good day, good morning, good evening to everybody all over the world who have joined us today in this program hosted by South Asia Peace Action Network. This is a group of individuals all over the world who are actually concerned about human rights and people-to-people contact all over South Asian region. So we have joined together for quite some time now to take up issues mainly focused on human rights in the country. And Sapon does, we call the South Asia Peace Action Network as Sapon in short. And Sapon actually hosts a lot of series of activities and trying to think people and work towards peace in the region. Today, actually, after having taken the word peace, I would like to join hands all over South Asia and globally to actually rejoice in Gandhiji's Gandhi Jayanti, which is today, 2nd October. But at the same time, while joining hands, celebrating Gandhiji's peace initiatives till today, it's also very sad to actually think about the difficulties that the human race is facing all over the world, even today at this age. You know, thinking of what's happening in Iran recently with the hijab, and just recently, the suicides in Afghanistan, and the way protection is not given, especially to women in the country, actually makes one weep and bleed all over the world. Now, looking at that, we also look at different difficulties that people all over the human race face all over the globe, and specifically coming to South Asia. When we remember the atrocities that has been happening in different countries like Afghanistan, and also it's not only issues that is based on human rights, violence against women and minority communities, but also disaster and impact of climate change, which many a times may not be totally because of the country where the calamity is happening. I also want all of you to remember of the thousands of lives that have been lost in the floods of Pakistan, which has been hit in a very devastating way like never before. Having thought of talked about all these sad episodes, I would also like you to think that there are people all over the world and people focused in South Asia who actually want to join hands and try to see if we can make lives better for people in the region by start a discourse and dialogue which can take issues further ahead. This is Namrata Sharma from Nepal. I am a journalist who started as a working journalist since 1990, when for the first time freedom of press was established in the country. Since then, I've been writing and doing activism work focused on human rights, basically women's rights. And recently, I'm just immediate past president of the Center for Investigative Journalism. And at the moment, I'm doing a lot of cross-border stories focused on human trafficking. Having said that, I want to draw your attention to today's topic, that is rebuilding Sri Lanka, reforms or revolution. Why do we want to talk about Sri Lanka is because of the recent situation of the country, which has been hit like never before. The economic crisis, which led to a protest, the ousting of the cabinet, the fleeing of the president, and also the challenges that the people are facing day to day, even today. How and why this is going to affect the people in the coming days and in future. We have gathered here to talk about that. And actually, this is the first issue that Sapon is doing focused on country. And it is a continuous series that we will be continuing for months ahead. Now, before moving on to the topic of today, I would like to request, I would also, first of all, like to mention, I would also like to mention to you that we have actually a group of eminent people from all over the world, from South Asia, who have joined in to take this discuss forward. But it's a pleasure to be a part of them today. And before we move ahead on today's topic, I would like to request Suraj Khan to actually read the charter of Sapan, and that will clarify to you more on what Sapan actually is. Siraj Khan is a Karachi-born, Boston-based connoisseur of South Asian film music, a believer in using art and culture to build bridges between people and places. A global finance and audit specialist by profession, he has written scripts and directed concerts across the USA, UK, South Asia, and UAE. He sits on the board of several nonprofits and charities in USA, Pakistan, and India, and has been recognized for his work towards women's empowerment and services to children and youth. He is the outgoing president of Pakistan Association of Greater Boston. It's a pleasure to have you with us, Siraj. And I would like to request you to kindly read the Sapan Charter. Kindly unmute yourself.
Yes, good morning, good evening, wherever we are all over the globe. Welcome. It's an honor to be present here today. I've been invited to read the Sapan Charter. And let me just say that to add to what Namrata was saying, we are now, we are 94 actually founder members. And as of today, we are about 200 endorsing organizations and individuals. So Sapan may sound it's new, but it's got a lot of support in this in the last 1 year or so. So here is the founding charter of Sapan. Sapan is a coalition of individuals and representatives of various organizations joining hands for a minimum common agenda, which is reclaiming South Asia. In doing so, we reiterate our commitment to take forward the principles and ideals of peace, justice, democracy, and human rights articulated by visionaries like Dr. Mubashir Hassan, Nikhil Chakravarti, Asma Jangir, Nirmala Deshpande, Kuldeep Nair, Rajini Kotari, among others. A visa-free South Asia, or Confederation of Nations with soft borders, a region in which each nation ensures quality education, justice, freedom of expression, and religion to its own citizens, as well as support and solidarity of those of the other nations. We aim to reclaim South Asia, and to quote another of our mentors and visionaries, the late I. Rahman, we support the objectives of SAARC, the South Asian Association of Regional Cooperation. And I quote, to promote the welfare of the peoples of South Asia and to improve the quality of life, to accelerate the economic growth, social progress, the cultural development in the region, and to provide all individuals the opportunity to live in dignity and to realize their full potential, to promote and strengthen collective self-reliance among countries of South Asia, to contribute to mutual trust, understanding, appreciation of another's problems. to promote active collaboration and mutual assistance in the economic, social, cultural, technical, and scientific fields, to strengthen cooperation with other developing countries, to strengthen cooperation among themselves in international forums on matters of common interest, and to cooperate with international and regional organizations with similar aims and purposes, unquote. The South Asia Peace Action Network, therefore, calls on all governments and peoples of South Asian nations to work towards, and there are 3 points here. Number one, instituting soft borders and visa-free South Asia, or visa on arrival, to allow freedom of trade and travel to each other's nations. 2, ensure human rights and dignity for all their citizens, including religious and ethnic minorities, women, children, and other oppressed communities. And number 3, cooperate in areas related to public health, culture, and legal reform, education, environment, climate change, water issues, disarmament, demilitarization, and finally, denuclearization. Thank you.
Namrata, you need to unmute.
Sorry, I was sorry. Thank you, Siraj Khan, for reading out the Sapan Charter. I now move on to the other agenda of the day. In every monthly seminar that Sapan has, we have a system of remembering all of those who have left us in the last month and since last we met, and those who have actually made a difference to South Asia and the world. And so for that, I would like to request Sushmita Pritha to present the in memoriam. But before that, I would like to introduce you, Sushmita Pritha, who is a journalist, writer, and activist from Bangladesh. And she is now the editor of the opinion page of the Daily Star, Dhaka, which is Bangladesh's leading English daily. And a main beat is writing on human rights, neoliberalism, feminism, and politics. Sushmita, I request you to kindly do the in memoriam.
Thanks, Namrata. Let me quickly share the screen. Hi, can everyone see the screen?
Yes, I can.
You can see. Great. Thank you, Namrata. We remember with gratitude the invaluable contributions of the academics and activists, the visionaries who devoted their lifetimes to establishing a just and peaceful South Asia. We remember Dr. Mubashir Hassan, Kuldeep Nair, Asma Jahangir, Aya Rehman, Nirmala Deshpande, Sufia Kamal, Sania Hussain, Rubina Saigal, Sabine Mahmood, Dr. Saman Kelegama, Dr. Iqbal Ahmed, Praful Bidwai, Rajni Kothari, Madanjit Singh, among others. We also remember Kamala Bhasin, who was also one such visionary who passed away last September on the 25th of 2021. She was an activist, poet, and writer. She pioneered the women's movement in India and indeed much of South Asia. We remember Dr. Abhijit Singh, who passed away this year on 29th August. He was an Indian economist who studied rural development. He held a number of important policymaking positions. He was the member Planning Commission of India and recommended minimum support price and universal public distribution system. We remember Gauri Chaudhary, who passed away this year on 9 September. She was a senior women's rights activist committed to female empowerment. She founded Action India, a community-based women's organization in New Delhi in 1976. She worked on eradicating gender-based violence through programs such as Beti Utsav, which were community celebrations that changed the narrative around the birth of a girl child. We remember Barry Hoffman, who passed away on 18 September. He was honorary professor emeritus at the National University of Science and Technology in Islamabad, Pakistan. He was also chairman executive committee of Boston Council Corps and a retired USAF officer. We remember Tariq Aziz, who passed away also on 18 September. He was a senior diplomat from Pakistan. He was former principal secretary to President Musharraf and negotiated a framework to settle the issue of Kashmir for a lasting peace between India and Pakistan, along with his Indian counterpart, Satinder Lamba, who passed away in July 2022. We remember Dr. Humayun Khan, who passed away on 22nd September. He was a diplomat of Pakistan who stood for Pakistan-India friendship. He was former ambassador, high commissioner, foreign secretary, and envoy to New Delhi. He was also chairman of the Institute of Rural Management. We remember Yusuf Masti Khan, who passed away on 29 September. He was a veteran Baloch nationalist leader from Karachi, Pakistan, with progressive ideals. He was president, Awami Workers' Party. He struggled against ethnic oppression, class exploitation, and militarization till his death. He supported Indigenous Rights Alliance and some prominent left-leaning political parties of Pakistan. Remember Ranish Moitra, who passed away on 26 September. He was a Bangladeshi journalist, columnist, and politician. He played an active role in people's movements, including the Liberation War, and was awarded the Ekushe Padak in 2018. We remember Zawar Hassan, who passed away on October 1st. He was a journalist born in Pratapgarh. He began as a sports journalist in Karachi with Associated Press of Pakistan in 1949. He worked at Daily Dawn, was a Nieman Fellow at Harvard 1967, and later a senior editorial writer at Morning News and The Sun. He launched a travel magazine called Focus on Pakistan. He's Bina's uncle. We're really sorry, Bina, for your loss, and we're grateful that you've joined us today, despite this tragic loss in your life. May they all rest in peace and power. Thank you.
Thank you, Sushmita. Thank you, Sushmita, for the in memoriam. I mean, this is a time our hearts are filled with the thoughts of all the individuals that Sushmita just read about. And we also want to acknowledge their contributions to us and also join hands with Sushmita in sharing in grief with Bina today, who's just lost her uncle. I now want to move ahead with today's topic, building Sri Lanka, reforms or revolution. This panel will be moderated by Nalaka Gunawardene, and we have one excellent. Okay. I will first introduce our moderator for today. Nalaka Gunawardene is a writer and journalist and covers science, development, and public health issues for print and broadcast and web outlets. He has over the past 30 years won 3 national awards for excellence in science communication. He now works as a freelance writer, editor, and a communication consultant on public communication of science and development issues. It's a pleasure to have you with us, Nalaka, to moderate this session. And with you, we have excellent panelists. And actually, we have tried to make this an intergenerational panel. We have Amita Arud Pragasan, Marlon Arya Singhe, and Rehana Hawe. So Nalaka will actually be introducing them. I hand over the the virtual space to you now, Nalaka, to take the panel ahead, moderate the session, and I'm here for. Over to
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Namrata. And thank you, Sapan, for giving us this opportunity to talk about Sri Lanka's multiple crises. Excuse me. This year, as the world watched, Sri Lanka had its worst economic crisis in decades, which soon turned into a major political crisis. We have had massive and sustained public protests by outraged citizens, many of us saying enough is enough. Between April and July this year, these protests forced a number of dramatic political changes. First, it forced the resignation of the entire cabinet of ministers in April, then forced the resignation of Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa in May, and finally pushed out or forced the resignation of President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who actually first fled the country in mid-July and resigned from overseas. Now, in the 970 days that Gotabaya Rajapaksa was president, he bankrupted the country and left a sorry legacy behind, which his successors in office and all of us are now having to cope with. Under his watch, macroeconomic mismanagement depleted almost all of Sri Lanka's foreign reserves. So in mid-April, the country suspended servicing its foreign debts, accumulated foreign debts of US$ 50 billion. The country remains so broke that it struggles even now to import essentials, essential food, medicine, petroleum, and other basic needs. We've been surviving the past many months thanks to the generosity of friendly nations, especially South Asian nations led by India. Most of us are struggling under hyperinflation. In August, the last month for which the numbers are available, inflation in Sri Lanka was 64%. 64%, the highest in Asia. And food inflation was even higher, 91%. Livelihoods are being lost at a massive scale as businesses collapse. And a humanitarian crisis of hunger, malnutrition, hospital services all undermined, and many other impacts is engulfing now most of us, 22 million citizens in Sri Lanka. So how did Sri Lanka reach this abysmal point? And more important, who must be held accountable for this cascading policy blunders? Will there be accountability? We await that accountability. And meanwhile, what is the way out and what is the way forward? And can economic and political reforms succeed while the old political order still remains largely entrenched? These are some of the questions we want to explore. We begin by acknowledging Sri Lanka's crises are complex, and we may not be able to answer all these big questions in about an hour of conversation that we have. However, it's extremely important that we raise these questions and we share our insights with everyone else from overseas who have been watching with concern what is unfolding in Sri Lanka. And to have that conversation with me, I'm very grateful that we have three thought leaders joining me. And these are people who have been analyzing the current crisis from different perspectives. So we have Rehana Tawfiq, who is an economist who's worked for leading think tanks and who's publicly sharing her expertise, demystifying the current economic crisis. So we'll talk to her in a minute. We have Amita Arupragasam, a policy advisor and research analyst, who's been looking at the political economy of what is happening and asking the question of why, what is happening and why is it happening. And then we have Malnutrition Singh, author and editor, who also works as a journalist and who's been bearing witness to the public protests and again showcasing the struggles of a nation under siege. We will have our co-moderator Nirupama Subramaniam, a senior journalist with the Indian Express. She's covered Sri Lanka extensively over the many years. She will offer the closing remarks. So what I want to do is, rather than do the conventional webinar format of asking each speaker to say a few minutes of opening remarks, I want to have this as a conversation from the very outset. So I'll talk with our three speakers for about an hour, and then we'll have time for taking audience questions. So please post them through chat so that organizers can line them up. Let me first talk to Rehana, because this is the most visible part of the crisis emerged on the economic front. It's been building up over the years, but it boiled over this year. So Rehana, how did Sri Lanka reach this point of an acute economic crisis? What's your compact explanation for somebody who doesn't know too much of our intricacies? How would you sum it up in a couple of minutes?
Thank you, Nalaka. I'll try to be as compact as possible, although it is a rather complicated topic to talk about. So, I mean, if you look at the roots of Sri Lanka's crisis, really it boils down to what we call a twin deficit problem. That's the fact that Sri Lanka runs both a fiscal deficit and a current account deficit. So the government spends a lot more than it earns. And as a country, we import a lot more than we export. So these two structural problems have been sort of plaguing the Sri Lankan economy for many decades. And several governments have failed to really address and try to resolve these. So essentially, we built, the foundations of Sri Lanka were built, on a precipice. And then in 2019, from 2019 onwards, there was what I personally call a series of bad decisions, which were made in quick succession, which led to Sri Lanka facing an economic crisis of a magnitude that it has never experienced before. So in 2019, in November 2019, when President Gotabaya Rajapaksa won the elections, he immediately announced a very devastating tax cut, which actually led to a loss of rupees $600 billion to the government coffers. This was about 1/3 of government revenue. And the government also made no effort at that point to reduce expenditures. Generally, when you reduce your income, you have to reduce your expenditures as well, but that's not what the government did. And that led to the fiscal deficit doubling in between 2019 and 2020. And at that point, public debt as a percentage of GDP was reached a new high of over 100% of Sri Lanka's GDP. And actually this led to, Sri Lanka was in an IMF program from 2016 for a 4-year structural adjustment program. But unfortunately, because of these tax cuts, we lost, the final few tranches of the IMF disbursement and the program. So this was a 1.5 billion program at the time. And the tax cuts also led to credit ratings downgrades, which meant that Sri Lanka, the government could no longer, it was harder to go out and borrow from international finance markets. And over time, and then came COVID, and by that time, Sri Lanka's debt was unsustainable. And I think as early as April 2020, the IMF had warned Sri Lanka that Sri Lanka's debt was unsustainable, and then it could not lend in an emergency even to Sri Lanka. So this problem was, it's not something new, and it's not something that came about suddenly, but it was a matter of all these, decisions which were short-sighted and not considering the full, the economic situation of the country. And then there's also other compounding factors, for example, and this is a very important factor as well, the monetary policy of the country contributed very heavily to the economic crisis. The Central Bank of Sri Lanka followed a very accommodative monetary policy. Because the government could no longer go out and borrow internationally, it had to turn to the central bank. And within 2 years, between 2020 and 2022, the money supply of Sri Lanka expanded by about 40%. Now, generally, when you expand money supply, if you want to maintain inflation at reasonable levels, that means the economy must also be producing at a similar rate. But unfortunately, with COVID, there were a lot of production slowdowns. The economy came to standstill. We had very prolonged lockdowns as well. We were just not producing at that rate. The economy was, somewhat contracting. And now you're seeing the effects, like you said, Nalak, inflation is at 60-70%. Food inflation is 100%, and people are really struggling. Along with this, generally you print money that causes an inflationary pressure. So generally, what you would expect a central bank to do is at least to increase interest rates so that you can try to maintain some sort of cap on inflation. But unfortunately, they decided to hold interest rates artificially low as well, which meant that people and businesses were consuming more and more. And some of this leaked over into import demand, which put pressure on the rupee to depreciate further. And then again, the monetary board decided, we are gonna hold the exchange rate at a fixed rate. This led to a loss of about $2.5 billion. This led to a loss of about $1.6 billion of worker remittances, because the fixed exchange rate wasn't actually reflecting the demand for the dollar on the real market. And I think this was revealed in a parliamentary investigation as well, that the government, the central bank used about $2.5 billion of our, very meager $7 billion of foreign reserves to defend the rupee at that rate.
Right. Sorry to interrupt. So a billion here, $1 billion here, $1 billion there, and suddenly you're talking about real money, as the saying goes. So at the beginning of Gotabaya Rajapaksa's 970 days, the country had foreign reserves of $7 billion. When he left, we had practically nothing. So
that's
in
right.
970 days, I want to keep bringing up this, less than 1,000 days, he ran through his amateurism, his macroeconomic mismanagement, depleted $7 billion US dollars, and bankrupted the country externally, and also bankrupted the country and gave rise to this runaway inflation that we are still reeling under. I know I don't want to oversimplify anything, but there's this argument by some that if not for the twin external pressures, first of the pandemic and then of the Russia-Ukraine war, Sri Lanka could somehow manage to balance, juggle all this. Is that a viable argument? Rehana? I'm
There seem
still
to be some
asking you.
internet issues.
Okay. That's the other factor we are living with. Power cuts that are often scheduled, sometimes not scheduled, that could interrupt any one of us in mid-air, as it were. Looks like we've lost Rehana's connection. Let's park that question for now, and let's turn to Amita. We are, as I hope the audience will bear with us. We are improvising as we
Sorry,
go along.
Nalaka, I'm back.
Oh, you are
That
back. Oh,
helps.
all right. Okay. Welcome back. For a moment, I thought the power cut had rudely cut you off. So I was asking, if not for the pandemic and Ukraine, could Sri Lanka have somehow juggled everything as we used to do?
I don't agree with that at all. There's a difference I think we should look at in terms of what caused the crisis, and then there are factors which aggravated the crisis. So in my opinion, the COVID pandemic and the Russian-Ukraine war obviously aggravated Sri Lanka's economic crisis, but the causes are very, very different and very obvious, and very much to do with the economic decision making by the powers that be and their economic advisors and their officials. Because if you look at the timeline, so the tax cuts came in November 2019, which led to a downgrade almost immediately in our sovereign ratings. And then this was again revealed in another parliamentary committee hearing that in March or April 2020, so this was like 1 or 2 weeks or maybe 3 to 4 weeks of Sri Lanka going into its first lockdown. The Sri Lankan government had actually approached the IMF and asked for a rapid finance instrument, an emergency loan. And at that time itself, the IMF had told Sri Lanka that Sri Lanka's debt is not sustainable and that the IMF cannot lend to Sri Lanka at that point. So this was back in March, April 2020. Way before, I mean, at that point, nobody really knew where the COVID pandemic would be. Nobody really thought it would be, 2 years long or extended lockdowns. And then, the Russian-Ukraine war was not something that was even on the radar at that point. So we had this structural balance of payment issue. And usually what we do is we go out and borrow, but because of the tax cuts, which led to our debt becoming unsustainable, it led to a credit rating downgrade, and we couldn't go out and borrow from international finance markets like we usually do. So that is the key problem. And of course, COVID obviously aggravated things because we lost tourism earnings, and the government had to spend more, for public health related to, COVID-related public health services, and the global economy was in shambles. So those definitely aggravated it. But I don't agree that it is, it is the cause of Sri Lanka's issue, Sri Lanka's economic crisis.
Okay. So in April, Sri Lanka was forced to suspend foreign debt repayments for an unspecified period of time because we no longer had foreign currency to pay back capital or interest. How easy or difficult is it going to be Sri Lanka's for Sri Lanka to negotiate with its various creditors? So there are government bilateral creditors, then there are multilateral agencies, the World Bank and Asian Development Bank, and then there are the private creditors. So there are 3 kinds and a multitude of creditors. And how easy or hard is it to negotiate a debt restructuring? Because this is what the government is trying to do now.
Well, it's very difficult to say because there are 2 parts to the debt restructuring. First is the IMF program, and next is our agreement with our creditors. And there are obviously 3 types of creditors, like you mentioned: the bilateral, multilateral, and private lenders. Now, multilateral lenders are generally considered to be concessional lenders, so that does not go into debt restructuring. So we would have to be focusing on our bilateral lenders and our private lenders. Now, in my opinion, with private lenders, it is a lot more straightforward, because what they will be looking at is, is our economic reform plan credible? Is it going to, how fast is it going to help Sri Lanka pay us back? Are we going to be assured of getting our money back eventually, at least, at some point? So I think that's pretty straightforward. But with bilateral lenders, it's a bit more complex because of the whole geopolitics involved, in that negotiation. In Sri Lanka, we are seeing the Quad, for example, playing a big role in Sri Lanka's debt restructuring. And then we are seeing sort of a power tussle between Japan and China, India and China. And China has a big role to play in Sri Lanka's debt restructuring, because it is a very important lender to the country. We are yet to see a firm commitment from China to Sri Lanka's debt restructuring. They haven't stated specifically that they will be participating in it. And then if you look at, for example, how China held out in Zambia, for example, it held out for about 18 months and delayed the IMF program by 18 months. And debt restructuring is quite new to China as well. And then they're also facing, it's not just Sri Lanka who has borrowed from China and is having difficulty paying back. There are other countries. Of course, Sri Lanka is very small in comparison to some of the other countries that have borrowed. But so there are lots of factors, I think, that will come into play when deciding how easy or hard, it's going to be. I think the timeline is something like we might have a plan in place by the end of the year, but really it depends on how good our government is at negotiating with these lenders. How much credibility Sri Lanka can really, how much credibility does Sri Lanka really have?
So fingers crossed there. The government of current President Ranil Wickremesinghe has recently reached a staff level agreement with the IMF for a bailout package of $2.9 billion. How much relief can Sri Lanka get from this? And this 2.9 billion also is not coming at once. It's over a period of time. Will that bring enough relief?
Well, I think the IMF package is far more important than just the $2.9 billion that it will bring to Sri Lanka eventually.
Why?
Because it has what the IMF staff level agreement shows is that, okay, Sri Lankan officials have managed to shore up a plan that is agreeable and credible to the IMF. So it shows shows international observers that Sri Lanka is being backed by a credible institution and has put forward a credible and, more importantly, sustainable plan for the economy to address these structural problems and get back on track so that we'll one day be able to make our debt sustainable again. So I think in terms of in the immediate situation, the IMF has played its part by helping Sri Lanka come to this staff level agreement. But now it's up to the government of Sri Lanka to go out and secure what we call bridge financing, which is really to bridge the gap between the IMF program coming through and the creditor negotiation, the negotiations being finalized, and the situation we are at right now. Because as you said, Sri Lanka has almost no reserves, and we are literally living hand to mouth. We are using whatever dollars to buy some of our essentials. We are not able to meet our full essential import need. There are shortages of medicines. There are, fuel is still being rationed. All of this is still happening. This is part of, daily normal life now in Sri Lanka. So there is a big role for the government to play in bridging that need for finances. So now it has to go out and show, okay, look, we have a plan. Please give us some aid, some support to get back on track.
Thank you, Rehana. So let me now turn to Amita to come at these crises from another angle. The economic crisis built up over time, as Rehanna said, and it paved the way to a political crisis with outraged citizens protesting against a government and an establishment, actually, that has failed them on many fronts. What were the main grievances that brought people to the streets and kept them there for weeks after weeks?
Well, I think, the protesters had many different demands and many different types of grievances. If you had walked through Galface Green during the time of the protests, you would have been able to see just how many different types of interests were represented by the different types of banners and the different causes that were present there. But before the parliamentary process that led to the presidency of Ranil Wickremesinghe, so between March and mid-July, it was apparent that the protesters had two main goals. That was first for the president to resign, and then also for the Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa to resign. Their secondary goals were more diverse, and because the protests themselves have been so decentralized and there have been so many different individuals, unplanned, unorganized, attending the protests, it's been really hard for representatives or those who claim to be representatives to come up with a single coherent list of secondary demands. But the secondary demands that seem to be more popular included things like abolishing the executive presidency, ending nepotism, corruption, strengthening social assistance programs, getting rid of the prevention of the PTA or the Prevention of Terrorism Act, releasing political prisoners, things like seeking justice for the families that disappeared. Lots of demands actually centered around strengthening democratic institutions. But if you kind of look at this at another level, it's interesting to me, I think, that a lot of the protests had very political objectives in these, when you walked around the protest sites. But of course, underpinning everything was the economic hardship that individuals were facing. Of course, individuals wanted fuel. They were pushed out to protest sites because there were power cuts and there was no way of getting gas, and inflation was rising, so the cost of food was getting higher and higher, and people just couldn't afford all of these things. But it's interesting that a lot of the protesters felt these things, felt the fuel crisis and the crunch at home, and then expressed this in terms of political objectives or political desires at the protest sites.
So the Rajapaksas were driven out of their high office by some of the biggest protesters Sri Lanka has seen in recent decades. Did that unite, as it seemed to me for a while? Did the protests unite our usually very divided society?
Okay, it's an interesting question, because, and I see you've chosen your words very carefully. You said biggest protests, right? Because one thing that I think when reporters and analysts were talking about these protests, they were saying, oh, these are the longest, largest, biggest protests Sri Lanka has ever seen. And actually a segment of the Tamil community came out and said, actually, we have been protesting, and we've had for decades, and the families of the missing have been protesting now for over 2,000 days, and that's the longest running protest in Sri Lanka. So there were moments
in Mullaitivu, the mothers and relatives, the women of the disappeared, have been day after day, day and night, been doing this, and now 2,000 plus days. That didn't get as much media. Occasionally it did with the sympathetic media, but not nearly as much as it deserved, right?
Yeah, okay. So the protests in the South, have arisen out of this economic crisis have been large. They've been massive, right? They've brought out more people to the South than we've ever seen before, I think. And in a way, the country was united. To go back to your original question, to circle back, the country was united at many points. And I think, whatever the words we use, I think even in the Tamil areas, even though there was a hesitation about, oh, like, we've been protesting, the South hasn't joined us in our protests. Why should we go out to the Southern protests? Why should we show solidarity with these groups when we've had so little solidarity in the past? I think that sentiment was there. But of course, also the North and East, which are these sites of mass atrocity and war crimes and so on. Of course, they are also suffering from economic hardship at this time. Economic crisis is not isolated to a single geographical region, right? It is affecting these areas, and some of these areas are actually very poor compared to the other provinces in the country. So they're also being affected. And I think there was empathy. Like, there was empathy, there was an understanding throughout the country of what it meant to not be able to have food or to be able to afford food. But I think there was also at the same time a hesitation to go out, because the North and the East have not faced the same kinds of solidarity from the South when they have been protesting, and also because there is genuine fear. There's genuine fear for minority communities showing up at protest sites, because there are laws that have been weaponized against minority communities, like the PTA is one of them, right?
The prevention of terrorism.
Exactly. It has
Act.
been,
yeah.
Yes, it has been weaponized against minority communities who have been described as terrorists in order to alienate them, in order to demonize them. And that was a tactic that was also tried during the protests. It was at certain points, government rhetoric was about how the protests were some kind of diasporic conspiracy or some minority conspiracy, right? So there was also fear, I think, which meant that the unity wasn't as strong as it could have been, or that the North-South unity wasn't as strong as it could have been, but there were still moments of unity. And I think the North and the East never really voted for the president to begin with. So if the South was coming out and saying, we want the president to go home, it's not like the North was going to say, actually, we want him to stay. So one factor that kept echoing in the South during the recent protests and in the North and East for much longer is the demand for accountability at all levels of government, in terms of public funds, in terms of policy decisions, but also in terms of the security establishment and their conduct. Have there been any gains on this front, on accountability? This demand for accountability really precedes this economic crisis. I think in 2015 as well, when a new government came in, a good governance coalition came in, there were also demands for accountability for some of the alleged crimes conducted and corruption that was seen to be associated with the Rajapaksa family. But that didn't happen, and there was no accountability. And I think, and that, I mean, obviously it's the same now. There hasn't been accountability really of any substance. I'd say that of course there have been resignations. I'll get to that later, and why that's not actually full accountability. But for me, in my opinion, accountability requires a transition of power, a genuine transition of power. Right. And that's why accountability never happened in 2015. There wasn't a transition of power. There was the same political establishment that, facilitated corruption, or that allowed for corruption, remained intact despite the change of government, or despite the change of some political actors. And so when it came time to have accountability, it wasn't a meaningful or substantive accountability that occurred. And I at the time I was working one of my jobs was as the head of research and policy at the Secretariat for coordinating reconciliation mechanisms. So my job was to try and bring in some accountability through mechanisms like the truth-seeking mechanism, the accountability mechanism, the Office of Missing Persons, the Office of Reparations, right? Those mechanisms that we drafted, that we created, they were toothless at the end of the day, because there wasn't a transition of power. And that's the same thing that's happening today. There isn't a transition of power. And that's because, you know, of course, the president has resigned, and it seems, right, if you look at this from an external perspective, it seems like, oh, something has happened, some massive transition has happened, right? And some big political change has happened. But we have to ask ourselves, are these individuals simply taking a step back? Are they able to come back into the political arrangement? Are they still controlling this, you know, pulling the strings? If that's the case, then there hasn't been a transition of power, and we cannot actually, we can't actually expect genuine accountability. We just can't. And so in that sense, I think, you know, that I haven't seen, we've seen some, you know, we've seen the resignations. Of course, even if you use transitional justice language, a resignation can be considered maybe like a less severe, but a form of accountability, right?
Yeah.
But
it may also be a tactical retreat.
Exactly, it can be a tactical retreat. And I think it's really important to make that distinction and to understand what's happening, and not to confuse the two. We've seen throughout these protests a lot of moves that appear to be forms of accountability, right? Even for example, I think you talked about the resignations of cabinet members, right? But those weren't really resignations, were they? Those cabinet members stepped down, and then just a while later, they stepped back into their positions. Those were cabinet reshuffles. Those individuals.
Yes, and one by one, most of them are back holding the same or different portfolios.
Absolutely. So the status, the power arrangements have not changed. And if the power arrangements don't change, all of this is just theatrical. It's a performance. It's a performance to quell public discontent, right? And I think this political establishment is very strategic and very good at demonstrating that something is being done. But we really have to be cautious about that and cautious about that, because President Gotabaya Rajapaksa has left, but he's also back. And
he returned to the country after a few weeks in Southeast Asia.
Right,
he's been back now for about a month.
He's been back.
Yeah.
And
he's not only back, he's been housed and protected using public funds.
Exactly. So
much to the dismay of citizens.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I guess the question is, like, can we really expect accountability under these circumstances where the political establishment is very much intact? I think if we learned anything from 2015, the answer is just no, we can't. And it's a very sad and disillusioning answer, given how many people have expressed their discontent with this government and how many people have come out and taken risks to be out there. But I'm not very optimistic.
Okay, so I'm going to bring forward the question I was going to ask all of you a bit later, which is, some are saying that this current parliament, elected in August 2020, a free and fair election for the most part, a duly elected parliament, which has 5 years, is just into its third year, beginning of the third year. So not even halfway into its full elected term. But some are saying this parliament has lost legitimacy, though it's legally elected, and that we should go for a premature general election. Can a general election take this process forward in a meaningful, substantial way? Amita and also Rehana and Marlon, what do you think?
Shall I start?
Yeah, you start, Amita.
Okay, I think for me, it's important to think about legitimacy in two different ways: legal or constitutional legitimacy, and then popular legitimacy. And I think we can't confuse the two. Of course, the government has a mandate, a strong mandate. Actually, when they were voted in, there was high voter turnout, over 70% plus a 2/3 supermajority. And so they have a legal or constitutional mandate. The parliamentary procedure that allowed for the election or the rise of Ranil Wickremesinghe to be our current president was again constitutional. So they do have constitutional legal legitimacy, it would seem. Do they have popular legitimacy? That's a whole different question. Like, you have like the largest historical protest in the country. People are out. And also one thing to point out about those protests, people were coming into on July 9th, when the biggest protest happened. People were coming into the capital to protest when they didn't have fuel. They didn't have means to get into the capital, but they were there. They wanted to be there. They got onto whatever vehicle that they could find and made sure that they were there physically. And that was also they were at risk of state repression. There were military personnel out there. Nobody knew what was going to happen. People were concerned. Was there going to be shooting? Nobody knew. But they came out by numbers, and I think in that sense you can't dismiss that. That is if anything, it's a show that this government has lost its popular legitimacy. It really has. But I am making a distinction between constitutional legal legitimacy and popular legitimacy. Although, of course, you can also argue that this government has bent and used the law to serve their political interests in so many ways that legal legitimacy or constitutional legitimacy, like, I honestly, it's like a whole nother debate whether that.
So when you say this government, are you referring to the Rajapaksa Wickremesinghe continuum?
I mean, it's all the same. It's a continuity. As you've said in your word, it's the same. Yes. Ranil Wickremesinghe has enabled the continuity of the Rajapaksas in government, and so yeah, it's the same to me.
Right. Marlon and Rehana, can a general election in the coming months radically change and pave the way forward for Sri Lanka?
Yeah, so going back to what Amita was saying about legitimacy and the points that you guys made, I mean, you can't, like Amita also said, we can't equate, Sri Lankans coming together, from all over the island to an election. But this expression of dissent by the majority was directed not just at the Gotabaya and the Rajapaksas, but it was a rejection, in my opinion, of the current parliament as well. Because if you look at the current parliament, it's completely fractured. There are many divisions within the parliament, and the president has used very recently, state ministerial posts, something like 38, to keep the SLPP, the majority parliamentarians, happy. But I feel that it's an uneasy peace that will soon implode. Because, I mean, as we have seen in history, Ranil Wickremesinghe, he can't really work with others. So this is why, even I have consistently stated that elections are the only way to go, even as far back as in April, when Gotabaya Rajapaksa was inviting other political parties to form an interim government, which I felt at that time and even now would be completely farcical, because the composition of the parliament has not changed. So I still haven't changed my mind. Like Amita has said, nothing has changed, right? It's Gotabaya who was in power a few months back. Now it's Ranil who is in power, but the composition of the parliament has not changed. And I think Rehana can elaborate further. To have economic stability, we must have political stability, and measuring the mandate of the people, for me at this moment in time, is absolutely essential.
Right, Rehana, looking at it from an economic reforms perspective, do the reforms need a fresh election and a fresh mandate?
I think Amita has raised a very, very sort of valid, dichotomy between the constitutional legitimacy and the popular legitimacy. And I think for economic reforms, because we are talking about, very radical, we are talking about essentially changing the structure of Sri Lanka, the economy, how it operates, how it runs. And that's going to upset, a lot of different groups. Obviously, it's going to benefit the country as a whole, but it's going to, upset a lot of Western groups. And, I think that's where popular legitimacy comes in, because you can't really have a government doing very radical and very massive reforms if the people don't accept the legitimacy of this government. And I think, as all of you correctly pointed out, it is the same sort of, forgive my language, but it is the same donkeys who are running the show. We had the same ministers who were part of the cabinet that oversaw the decisions that led to the crisis, trying to come up with a plan to get us out of the crisis. And these politicians have been in power for several, they've been cabinet ministers in multiple different governments. It's not something that they, came into just one time. They have consistently overlooked the sort of chipping away and the erosion of the Sri Lankan economy. So how can we possibly expect, these politicians and these ministers to be in charge of delivering Sri Lanka out of this crisis? Because what we are talking about is a very radical, very big change that the structure, to change the structure of the economy. You're talking about, you have to challenge vested interests if you're talking about, becoming export oriented. You have to address several of these corruption issues that are endemic in Sri Lanka. And, you can't do that with such an, with the same politicians. And you really need, I think, and I mean, the risk with an election, I think an election is good, and I think Sri Lanka needs it. But the risk with an election is that we, even the opposition itself is kind of lacking legitimacy. People are not really united behind who should, be our next government, because they themselves have not really, come out and sort of presented a, credible plan or a credible, something for people to get behind. And also they have also been in power several times before. So it's not like they are new either. So, of course, an election, I think, is important because you can change the composition, to be more, supportive of the reforms that are needed. But whether we will be able to get the kind of people into government, into parliament, who can really deliver Sri Lanka is still a question that's up in the air.
It's a pretty big question. I think we can agree, though, that an election, a general election, sooner is necessary, but not sufficient. It will also require a more mature electorate, voters voting more sensibly when they have a chance to elect the next parliament. It will also require better leadership, more accountable and more visionary leadership, because some of the reforms are not going to be popular at all. So there are multiple challenges. But let me turn to Marlon, because I haven't had a quick opening conversation with you, Marlon. You were bearing witness to the protests in and around Colombo from the very early stages. And you commented on it on social media. You later wrote up more reflective pieces. What was your take on people power, which later assumed the name Janata Aragale, or people struggle? what was your take of this people power?
Yeah, Nalik. So when I first went to the protest, I did not go with the intention of reporting them. As you know, I'm not a conventional journalist. So at the beginning, I'm referring to the silent protests, which started in Kohuala, and it mushroomed all over Colombo. But as the protest developed, I think it became evident to me and everyone else that this is a very unique moment in Sri Lanka's history. And I mean, Sri Lankans here can confirm there was an unprecedented amount of the use of the word unprecedented, to describe what was happening in Sri Lanka. So it became, by May, it became meaningless. So because every day something new was happening. So in my lifetime, I've never seen or heard of something like this happening in Sri Lanka. So because I guess we've seen political rallies, right? We've seen political rallies before with massive crowds coming into Colombo, but they were political rallies, backed by parties, often used to show strength. So I think the most unique thing about the Janata Aragale for me is, as its name suggests, that it was truly an organic movement that originated from the people. And I think even the speakers kind of touched on this. Like, Sri Lankans are quite apathetic, I guess, when it comes to politics. We get together every 4 or 5 years. I mean, during elections, we are very active. We are very conscious about what is going on. There's so much of like vigorous discussions. But once the elections are done, we go to sleep for the next 4 or 5 years. And our politicians, they know this, and they exploit it. So again, it was encouraging to see people from all walks of life, some who have never been vocal before, coming together, coming into the streets, occupying public spaces, and in one voice saying, saying no, I guess, to the malignant, corrupt political culture of this island. So that was encouraging to me.
Sorry, I was saying enough is something we heard repeated.
Enough is enough. Now, but the difference is, I think before these conversations were happening, people were all saying the same thing for a very long time. When people get together, when they start talking about politics, they say, okay, this is a corrupt, these are corrupt politicians. Why are we voting for them? And we go to the elections and we vote for them anyway. So, but this kind of movement and taking part in the movement, like literally coming onto the streets, I think that is something, for want of a better word, unprecedented.
The protesters' rallying call, well, one of the key ones was "Go Home, Gota," but wasn't it aimed at much more than one man, the then President Gotabaya? In an essay you wrote for Himal South Asian a few weeks ago, you said, and I want to quote your words, this slogan, "Go Home, Gota," represented the voices of Sri Lankans who had fought against injustice for decades, end of quote. Can you explain?
Yeah, I think, I mean, we can't take this slogan literally, because that would be quite odd. Now if you look at the Mirihana protest, outside of Gotabaya's residence, there were people from his, from the surrounding area who were chanting for him to go home with a lot of vigor, mind you. I mean, when he was already home, I mean, then this later became like a very, clichétic joke. So we have to, I think, look at it in a much more, delve into these slogans in a much more deeper, I mean, we need to go into it in a much more deeper way. So, I mean, I can talk about what they mean.
Malan,
and
you're breaking up, Malan. Sorry, we really can't make out what you're saying.
In the country and elsewhere,
Okay.
I mean, who stood nationalism to come into power?
Right.
Nalaka,
Yeah.
You can't hear what I'm saying? Or
yeah, no, now we can. Yeah. Now it's improved. Please continue.
Yeah, so basically what I'm trying to say is that these slogans, they encapsulate resistance, and it's resisting the regime. And the people who stood against the Rajapaksa brand of politics for nearly 2 decades. So, some people who spoke against them are now dead. There was a time when people disappeared for speaking up, when activists and journalists were assaulted and killed in broad daylight. So this was a regime of oppression and fear and intimidation. And if you take the term aragale also, for me, it's a quite a unique term, which means people struggle or to struggle. Now, the aragale, like I think Amita also very rightly pointed out, did not begin this year. It has a long history, and it did not end with the dismantling of Gota Gogama in Colombo and elsewhere. So while the movement was mainly against the venal, malignant political culture of the country, it also brought forth other aragalayas or other struggles of the other communities from the peripheries to the forefront. And these include Tamil and Muslim communities who have suffered under state-sponsored repression and violence, women and girls who still navigate patriarchal legal, social, and institutional structures. And of course, the LGBTQ community who are subjected to homophobia, systemic harassment, and police brutality under the arbitrary, abusive, the vagrancy ordinance from colonial times. So for me, these aragalayas will continue. So I think, so in that sense, for me and for a lot of people, when they hear these slogans, it invokes the past, and the present, and I think it's a form of imagination of the future as well.
Okay, now some of the protesters, especially those coming from backgrounds of trade unions or student unions or certain political parties who joined the citizen protests, now they've been advocating bypassing of the constitution, which means revolution, an ideal that is not shared by some of us. We are all for reforms, but not all of us are for revolution. So short of revolution, and this is a question for all three of you now, short of revolution, what are the options for meaningful reforms in Sri Lanka?
Just to continue from where I stopped and taking in your question,
Yes,
yes, there have been, I guess, different people who are part of the movement who have been advocating kind of extra constitutional, systems. I think one of the most frequent things that have come up in the past few months is this idea of a people's council. But I've spoken to many of them, and they see it as the next step in the Aragale, Aragale 2.0 or whatever. But the Aragale has a lot of 2.0, 2.01 to 3.0, whatever, right? So it has had a lot of phases. So for them, they see this as the next phase. But the problem is, for me personally, the problem is they're not able to explain what these People's Council entails. I think in the coming months, they're going to put out a sort of a manifesto or something like that, which explains what they mean. But at this point, it's quite vague. For me, in my opinion, like I said before, for me, elections are the only way. Constitutional means we need to, of course, it's not going to change. Systems change, it doesn't happen overnight, especially with a malignant, corrupt culture like ours, which have, lasted for decades. So the Aragale was a very important step, a very, I guess, important step towards the right direction. Elections might not bring the desired results, that it won't change the whole composition of the parliament, because this political culture is systemically entrenched. It's not just in politics, but in all domains. So it's not going to change. This system's change will not happen overnight. It will take a long time. So for me, the only way forward is through constitutional means. So which
Thank
means
you.
an election.
Thank you. To the others
Nalaka,
agree?
can I just intervene a bit? I mean, it's such a wonderful stream going on, and I feel like I don't know what's speaking in between, but just because of our agreement earlier, I'm just reminding you that it's 4 minutes left for 1 hour's this panel discussion, and you wanted to actually open up question answer for 25 minutes.
Thank you.
I'm just reminding you. I hope everybody forgives me.
Thank you, Namrata.
But there are
so-
people asking questions in the chat box. I can see now.
I'm sure. So, but let me ask the other two, Amita and Rehana. Revolution or reforms?
I'll go first.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very unfortunate that Sri Lankans. I mean, we are finding ourselves stuck in this situation where the constitution is not working in favor of the people. But still, I think that does not justify going beyond the constitution and sort of supporting some of the revolutionary claims that some of the student unions and certain political parties have.
Right.
So I do think that reforms is the way to go. And, after much deliberation and sort of back and forth, because at one point I was very hopeful of a massive change happening in Sri Lanka with the protests and things. But I think I have personally settled on what I call incremental change. I don't think we are going to see within this generation the kind of change that we would all be hopeful for, where the economy is it changes for the better in this amazing way, and it's going to benefit everybody. So I think what we can settle for is to make incremental changes so that eventually Sri Lanka is at a point where we are delivering sustainable economic growth and inclusive growth for everyone in the country.
Sounds like a generational project. Amita, I'm sorry to reduce it to a binary. It's a lot more complex, but short of revolution, do we go for reforms?
Yeah, this is a tough one for me to answer, because with revolution too, I mean, there's types of revolution, right? You can have peaceful and violent revolution. And I would argue that what we saw on July 9th was very close to a peaceful revolution, which I think for me is something that is very positive and constructive in a political context in which incremental reform is so slow, and where they're entrenched, these vested interests are so entrenched, right? And I think this is a kind of a dilemma, whether we should pursue incremental reform or something more radical that many people around the world have struggled with, from like if you think about the Malcolm X versus Martin Luther King type debates, or liberal versus radical feminists. People have, different groups and communities have been tussling over what the right approach to achieving real meaningful change is. In Sri Lanka, I feel very sad for this country, because I know that the challenges that we have going forward, including climate change, are massive. And if we don't make changes that are substantive and like equally massive, this country is, there's going to be very little hope. We have an aging population. We have we have people leaving the country every day. And people are not protesting anymore, maybe as much on the protest sites, but they're protesting with their feet. They're leaving the country. It's a form of protest as well. And honestly, like I have been an incremental reformist my entire life. I've worked in government, and I've worked in Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe's government as well. But I'm not very optimistic, to be honest, that that small incremental change is going to deliver us to the kind of country that I would like to live in, and that I would like to see my children live in someday.
Okay, let's start. Thank you, Amita, Rehana,
Sorry for
Marlon.
this conversation on such a morbid note. I apologize.
No, I think we have to acknowledge the grim reality and still persist. Despite the cynical establishment conniving and manipulating to undermine what this year's protests have really called for. Let's take some questions. Namrata, I've been scanning the chat, and do we
Yes.
have, other than these, do we have questions?
There are actually questions from two people that I can see here.
Okay.
Two questions from Siraj.
Yeah.
He comments. The first one is comments.
Mm.
Dealing with same devils cannot possibly turn into effective corrective action. And then he questions, what is the way forward? So that's
What is the way forward? Yes, this
Forward,
has
right.
been the underlying theme of our entire conversation.
Right.
Without making matters worse, without regressing, what is the way forward? How can we make meaningful change, even if it takes a generation for that to be completed? I think that's been the underlying theme of this conversation. Haste makes waste, but sometimes we also have to, as the protesters did, take a stand and defend it. What is the way forward? If you were asked, Amita, Rehana, Marlon, to give a quick answer to a very, very nuanced question, what is the way forward?
Should I start?
Yep.
Well, okay, so I think we've talked about the culpability of potentially global actors and of local actors as well. But Sri Lankans are ultimately culpable. The voters, the 6.9, brought these politicians into power, right? And there's no way out of this than Sri Lankans actually voting better, voting for politicians who represent the policies that we actually need, not for politicians who are going to provide them with handouts. You know, we need to educate ourselves. We need to vote better. We need to make sure we're not voting for people based on their ethnic, religious, or racial identities, but based on their policies. And to go back to something that Marlon said, which is, you know, we have this laissez-faire kind of attitude and approach to politics. We have this idea that, okay, like, you know, I think it has something to do with the fact that we've been through a civil war, and you know, we put our heads down and we're like, okay, let's do what we can do, and you know, get to the next day. But I think we really have to get beyond this what to do, like indifferent kind of attitude and way of thinking. We have younger people who have showed political interest and who have mobilized and who have come to the front, and they may not be connected to political dynasties, or they may not have like a large number of political connections or a large amount of money to run for office. But these are the people that need to be supported at this moment. And we need civil society to get behind them, because we can't trust the current representatives that we have. We need to empower new people to enter politics and not shame them or disown them or you know, tell them to take a step back or ridicule them.
Yeah.
I think this is a moment where we need new people, and we need people who have been participating in the Aragalia to come forward.
Right. What about Marlon and Rehana? What is the way forward, as the big question asks?
I agree.
Yeah,
with
so I guess,
sorry.
Sorry.
Okay.
One of you.
Okay. Shall I go?
Yeah.
Okay. I mean,
Yeah.
I agree with Amita that the electorate needs to educate itself, because we did have free and fair elections in the traditional sense. Like, we could go and vote for who we wanted. No one was trying to, you know, assault us or force us to do, you know, vote for particular people. Maybe a few cases, you know, notwithstanding. But we, I mean, as voters, as citizens, we don't really play much of a role in, you know, selecting who even the party nominates. You know, there's no process in which we are involved in that. So the nominations are made, and then there's an election campaign, and we see who's there, and then we go and select. As Marlon said, we usually select the same people. We complain about corruption. In 2015, we kicked the Rajapaksa government out based on the fact that they were so corrupt. We all agreed that they were corrupt. And then 4 or 5 years later, we bring them back. We say, it's okay, you're corrupt, but it's okay, you come back. So, I mean, I think the people, there has to be some sort of social change where people really look inward. What are you voting for? We are responsible. The voters are responsible for putting these politicians in power. So I think it's important to sort of introspect and come to terms with the fact that you are part of the problem as well. But talking from an economic perspective, I think economic literacy is very important. I always say that when it comes to economics among general population, economics is usually equivalent to cost of living. Anybody who comes and promises I will reduce the prices of rice, of dal, of fuel is usually going to win, because that's what economics is for Sri Lankans. But it's very important to understand from a policy perspective, because some of the decisions, you go back and you look, how did we really end up here? These are policy decisions. So I think it's very important for there to be some kind of systematic approach to improve the economic literacy of the population of Sri Lanka.
Yeah, listening to you reminded me of Bertolt Brecht's words. It's perhaps simpler to dissolve the people and elect a new people. Voter education certainly is a key element of going forward. Marlon, way forward.
Yeah, so I mean, I just have to kind of agree with both Amita and Rehana. But just to continue with the tone of morbidity that Amita brought forward, because we Sri Lankans, we love to wallow in misery. So some of the new faces, the alternatives that have been coming up through the Aragale. Now, what I see is that there is a continuation of the same old political culture there as well. Now, why I say this is, now, for example, we are talking about accountability. We spoke about how accountability is central to the protests, right? Now, accountability is for me, is about transparency and accepting truth. Without accepting truth, we can't have accountability. So, for example, when we look at our politicians, the political culture that had been, I guess, there for the last few decades was where we do not question our politicians. And our politicians, they're like, okay, how dare you question us? So there is that a certain, I guess, kind of stubbornness and this kind of, how the political class stood, separate from the rest. Now, this sort of stubbornness, I'm afraid to say, I see in the new phases or these alternative political movements as well, where they do not accept criticism, where they look at or where they see questions or where they take questions as, to be very personal and undermining them and their movement. So, so for me, I think any way forward would need that sort of transparency, that sort of, fearlessness to accept one's faults and accept criticism and address them and then move forward. Because all the political parties that we have right now, the main forces are, they have a history of mistakes that they have made over the last few decades. So those, they need to address them in order for them to have any sort of, future, a political future. For the alternative phases, the groups with political ambitions who came through the Aragalaya, they also need to take a very good hard look at themselves and look at the political culture of this country. This education needs to happen, at their level as well, and then take criticism, take these questions, and then build from that and move forward. That's how I think accountability can be achieved. And that's, for me, is the best way forward.
Okay, there's another question, and I'm going to paraphrase it. It's asking, isn't a large part of the current problem to do with the all-powerful executive presidency created by the current constitution. And the abolition of this executive presidency has been promised for at least 30 years and never really done. Anyone who wants to quickly respond to this question? Is that the fount of many of the problems of governance?
I think there are many issues with governance, and the executive presidency is actually symbolic of a massive problem that we face. This whole, everything that we've been talking about related to political culture. We can't question, authority. We can't question the apex of power. This individual being able to, appoint representatives to now not independent commissions, being able to pardon individuals without any real rhyme or reason. Of course, it's a massive problem. The centralization of power in one man or woman is a huge problem, and it's really representative of a lot of other governance problems as well that the country faces. So of course, the executive presidency needs to be abolished. Of course, there's no doubt about that, at least in my opinion.
Okay, I think there's increasingly growing consensus about that. Kavita is asking a more specific question. How many arrests have happened over the past few months? How many are still in detention? That's one question. And then the other question is, the queues seem to have shortened. So would you say that the food situation is getting better? Two specific questions. First one?
I want to go back to the question we were just asked on the executive presidency.
Sure.
To provide an example, right? And I think Rehana also mentioned the fertilizer ban, the chemical fertilizer ban, as being very devastating to our agricultural sector. And I think this whole, it's a huge, a terribly detrimental policy taken and not reversed by the powers that be. And the question is, even if it has nothing to do with the legal powers of the president, what is this political culture that allows one man to make all of these decisions without question, without accountability? There were many technocrats, many people from the agricultural industry who knew exactly how this would affect farmers and yields, agricultural yields. And they provided that criticism openly through letters multiple times. But one person, or whoever it is who was advising him, was able to take a decision on that, and it's had disastrous consequences. So again, another example of why so much power shouldn't be centralized in one person.
Right. So how many people have been arrested, detained? Marlon, do we have any numbers?
Yeah, so I think the last time I checked, it was about 2 weeks back. It was around 183. And I think now it has gone past 200. And I think this kind of illustrates Ranil Wickremesinghe's presidential term, because it has been exclusively focused on creating a climate of fear and to suppress dissent. And we've seen this witch hunt of the main phases of the protest for the last 2 months. And by, I think Amit also mentioned this, by weaponizing the law. Arbitrary arrests and crackdowns continue to this day. And I think the most sinister use of existing draconian legislation is where the leader of the student union, along with 2 others, were charged under the Prevention of Terrorism Act, effectively labeling them as terrorists. This is not new, because since this type of rhetoric was used throughout, even before he was president, Ranil labeled protesters as fascists. And most state actors, they engage in undermining and discrediting the movement by using this type of rhetoric. And I would have to say it has worked. The arbitrary arrests have created, like I said before, like this climate of fear. And some of these arrests have been absurd and sinister at the same time. The one who sat on the president's chair was arrested. The one who stole president's beer mug was arrested. And just last week, we saw that there was a circular issue where public officials are warned against expressing opinions on social media. And then again last week, under the Official Secrets Act, several high security zones were gazetted. And we just found out today that it is going to be revoked. So again, I think we can come back to the executive problem issue, presidency issue that Amita was just, the example that she pointed out. So we have Ranil Wickremesinghe coming up with a new gazette to come up with high security zones in Colombo, and then deciding, okay, this is not going to work. I'm going to repeal it. I'm going to reverse it.
Under immense pressure. I think it was because of pressure and criticism and threats of legal challenges this gazette has just been revoked.
Exactly. There were
I don't think he came to the realization on his own.
Exactly. So, but this type of, I guess, this type of reversing, I think that one of the main things which that Gotabaya identified with was this acts of reversing, right? He would issue a law or a ban or a gazette, and he would reverse it. So we have the same kind of, I guess, this sort of irresponsible decision making, misguided decisions, which, like Rehana said at the beginning, which have led us to this point with this position, are still being made by the executive president. So there's no question that has to be abolished. But again, I think, in referring to the arrests, our question has always been this. We are facing the worst economic crisis to hit this country. There's a food shortage. There's reports of malnutrition. Why are state resources being used to continue repression? Why isn't the state using all of its energy to sort out this crisis? But so far with Ranil Wickremesinghe's government, we haven't seen that happening.
The other question, I think, Rehana, perhaps you could try and answer that quickly. The queues seem to have shortened, at least in the media's reporting and photojournalism and so on. Does it mean that the food situation is getting better?
Yes, Nalaka, I think before I come to that, I just want to add something to the question on the concentration of power. So one example I can use to illustrate that is the Monetary Board of Sri Lanka, which is the apex monetary policy making body in the country. The governor of the central bank, who heads the Monetary Board, is appointed by the president. And then, 3 members, I can't remember exactly, stepped down. And then the other 3 members were appointed by the President Gotabaya again. And one of them, in fact, was a lawyer who had, who had legally represented, I can't remember the exact Rajapaksa, but one of the Rajapakshas even in a court case. So that's one example I can use to describe that concentration of power. Why does one person get to appoint whoever they want into positions? For the central bank has to be independent. That's just it's a basic economic principle, because otherwise you end up in being a basket case like we are. That's one example. And then another I can talk about is the inner circle. How how decisions are made outside the sort of the official or technical structure of the government. I think normally decisions regarding IMF and public finances are made by the finance ministry, but back in 2020 we had the secretary to the president, P.B. Jayasundar, actually talking about the fact that we are not going to go to IMF and making that decision that we are not going to go to IMF. But that's not his purview, or that's not his decision to make. But we had a system like that, a parallel system which was running. So obviously that concentration of power is a big problem and is part of the reason that we have ended up in this situation. Going back to the food situation, I don't agree that it's getting better. Actually, it's getting worse. As Marlon said, malnutrition is, I mean, I can't accurately describe just how bad it is and just how bad it is going to be. If you take just protein, protein food items like chicken, fish, it's completely unaffordable to majority of Sri Lankans. It has doubled in price. There are shortages in fish products, in chicken products, in other products, and egg even costs so much more. People just can't afford nutrition dense food, and they are opting to skip meals. They are eating less portion sizes. Children are coming to school sometimes without meals. They are coming to school sometimes with just rice and like a pol sambol or something like that. I mean, the way it has affected Sri Lankans is just devastating. And yes, queues, we are not seeing fuel queues now because of the rationing system which is in place. It does not mean that we have more fuel. It just means that it's just being rationed properly now. There is still a queue for milk powder in a close by shop, shop close by to where I live. People still queue up to buy milk powder because those are people who actually need milk powder. They have children, they have to give it. But a lot of people have stopped consuming milk powder where possible. They are drinking plain tea instead of drinking milk tea. So I don't think it's better. It's just maybe the optics of it look better, but it's not better.
And also, I think it's the way the international media, the foreign media, are no longer really reporting with sustained interest from Sri Lanka. The crisis is still very much there. It's no longer making dramatic headlines, and therefore we are largely forgotten. Whereas during the period April to July or even August, we had lots of parachute journalists arriving in Sri Lanka and hyping and offering very simplistic explanations of what was going on. I'm sure Nirupama might touch on that because she is someone who's been covering Sri Lanka over the years with great depth and understanding. But one more question that I want to quickly take up. It's again a big one. It's almost the elephant in the room that we didn't talk about, not because we want to avoid it, but because there's so much that we had to frame our conversation. Militarization. There is a question that's come just a couple of minutes ago asking, where is the military in all this, especially in helping to consolidate power so as to ensure that vested interests are mutually secured. Militarization has been a big part of Sri Lanka's crisis of governance. It has economic implications. It's perhaps a topic for another whole conversation, but very quickly, how do we explain to those who are not living the reality in Sri Lanka, the role of the military and the militarization? Who would like to take that on? Marlon, perhaps? Or anyone?
Yeah, like you said, Danik, it's a huge question. I mean, there are so many experts who have been studying militarization in Sri Lanka, talking about and advocating defunding the military. But I'll say, maybe I can just relate some of my experiences on the ground, what I saw. So whenever there was a protest, during the last few months, right, from April onwards, with the riot police, there was always, almost always, the military present. And what is their role in that? Their role in that whole, that scenario is to instill fear in people, right? And this is very different to the figure, the kind of mythicized figure of the war hero that we have had, from the end of the war, from 2009 onwards. So here, I think the South realized, and I think this is another point of, I guess, understanding and another step towards, quote unquote, understanding the other, where the South realized that, what the North and the East have been telling us for years, right, for decades, I guess, about the excessive brutality that is used by the military, the intimidation tactics that is used by the military to intimidate people, peaceful protesters. People could not, in the east and the north, they could not, light candles. That was seen as a threat. So that same, the same force was employed in the south as well. And the south, to be fair, I think we felt it, we understood it, and we saw it firsthand, we experienced it firsthand. And so, for example, the Gama was after Ranil Wickremesinghe was appointed president, not even 24 hours has passed. The military came and they dismantled the whole, protest site. So these instances, for example, once I was near the parliament and military personnel came on, on bikes with weapons, and they were going into the crowd, trying to provoke people and trying to provoke a response. And there were, the people were agitated because these are highly, politically charged atmospheres that they are that they're entering. And what we have seen, I think, for the last 6 months, that the police and the military, they are not qualified at all to deal with these volatile situations. The way that they deal with protesters, they have no understanding of how to negotiate that politically charged situation. So they would resort to is violence. Then the next step would be using arms. And we have seen at several points during the last, during the Aragale, there were people who were actually shot by the police and also by the military. People who died, while engaging in peaceful protests. So the military, in that sense, has played a very key role in suppressing dissent in the South. And I think one of the things that the people in the South realized is the fact that, okay, what the North and the East have been saying for decades is real, because they've seen that. And I think there was a very significant moment, for me, one of the most significant moments of the Aragale is when some of the people who were part of the protest, this was at the latter stages in July, I think July 13th or 15th, they actually questioned the military. And they said, while when we see the way that you treat us, right, we have no choice but to believe that you leave us no choice but to believe that war crimes could have been committed by the same force, military, that was glorified and deified a decade back. So I think that for me was one of the most unique moments in that.
So a moment of truth in the midst of so much going on. Amita, do you have a quick take on the militarization factor?
Yeah, I mean, I guess since we're talking about an economic crisis, it's always useful to talk about defense budgeting, right? And that's something that has come up as well in conversations about efficient expenditure and so on. Sri Lanka spends more now on defense than it used to during war. So we're spending like a country at war, and we're spending more than our peer countries on defense. We're spending more than like lower middle income countries and other post-conflict countries as well. That's not it's not even efficient, right? Like if you're thinking about what Sri Lanka should be doing in peacetime, should be spending this amount of money on defense. It's not efficient at all. So that's one thing. I think, defense expenditure on
just
defense.
To add to that, Aminta, I think you would know, I mean, since 2009, every subsequent government has increased the budget, and every year it has
We have some difficulty.
Like we are losing Marlon again.
Yeah, Marlon.
Just to remind you, we've just crossed timing, and
Okay,
just
we'll begin
it's such an
wrapping up.
excellent discussion. Again, I've become the devil's advocate here. But
Somebody has to be the timekeeper.
sorry
Thank
about
you.
that.
We'll start winding up, but let me allow Amita to finish what she was saying.
I mean, I think what Marlon was saying, that every subsequent government following the end of the war has been spending more on defense than the previous government. And that doesn't make sense, right? For a country that's at peacetime. I think we have to be careful about also what the composition of the military is. I think a lot of Marlon talked about, police brutality and the suspicion around the military that is now emerging in the South. But I'm not sure that there's a massive risk of military rule in Sri Lanka, not something like, in Myanmar, just because, the military doesn't have benefits to extract. If it was if it took over the reins of power right now, it would be very difficult to manage the country with an economic crisis. We don't have a history of military rule, and a lot of the soldiers themselves may understand what it's like to undergo economic hardship. I think a lot of the individuals who end up being soldiers in the military are doing so because it's a means of income. And I have said earlier that I think it's kind of like a social security system in a weird way, a very inefficient way of keeping families and people happy. But we need to rethink all of this. Because as Marlon has pointed out, this is not an efficient way to run a country. And it's not going to help peace. It's not going to help us emerge from this economic crisis either.
There are other questions, but we are out of time. There's one question though, which has come just a couple of minutes ago from Kawa Mumtaz, a dear colleague in Pakistan. What are the lessons for other countries in the region? Now, again, can I don't know if Marlon is back. Can I give our speakers, this is your last chance in today's conversation. If you can say in 1 minute, wrapping up, what are the key lessons, or what is the one big lesson that our South Asian neighbors can learn from Sri Lanka's cascading multiple crises? Let's start with Rehana.
If there is one lesson that we can draw from the experience of Sri Lanka, I think it is that not to fall for the gimmicks and the tricks of politicians, because that is 100% the reason that we are in this situation right now, and not to vote to concentrate power within very small and limited and very vested groups. So essentially to be more democratic in who you vote for, to be more democratic in the kind of policies that you support, so that you don't end up being like Sri Lanka.
Marlon?
Yeah, so I mean, in our coverage for Himal, I think we often hear from our Pakistan colleagues, our colleagues from Bangladesh and also Nepal, don't be like Sri Lanka, not to make the same mistake like Sri Lanka. So I guess we have, and we have used this word before, we are a case study for everyone, and especially to South Asia, of what not to do. So take our decisions in the past few years, and even if you go back decades, I think that those lessons are there. So we are a case study for South Asia and to everyone of what not to do.
A cautionary tale for other South Asians.
A cautionary tale.
Amita.
Yeah, I mean, I guess developing countries in South Asia, countries like Pakistan and Sri Lanka, are inherently much more vulnerable to default and this kind of economic crisis, because we don't have capital reserves, and capital is harder for us to access than, let's say, advanced economies. There's less wealth, to act as a buffer during these times, and less to invest in infrastructure and social welfare systems and so on. And we share a lot of the same problems, right? And I think there is actually virtue. There's a lot to be gained from South Asian countries actually thinking together about what we need from those who lend to us as well, in terms of debt transparency, in terms of what is good lending practices. We're talking about borrowing practices, but what are good lending practices? And in terms of what can we do to manage such economic crises and help each other out, but also what do we need in terms of our own institutions to hold those who borrow on our behalf, to hold them accountable. as well. So I think there's a lot of stuff, a lot of lessons that South Asia can collectively learn, and there's a lot of a lot that working together and collaborating can actually bring to our regions in terms of future sustainability as well.
Thank you. Thanks to all three of you, Rehana, Amita, and Malan, for having been wonderfully expressive in this conversation, which made my task as moderator a lot easier. Before I hand over to Nirupama, let me just say one thing. The Sri Lanka experience of the crisis of politics, economics, and governance, and the citizen responses to it needs to be better documented. Over and above the fleeting mass media coverage and even more fleeting social media user-generated content that we've seen this year, we need more reflective, more analytical documentation. And ideally, it should come from Sri Lankans ourselves. So here's hoping, wishing that one of our speakers or all of our speakers would consider, if you're not doing so already, to write a book or a long form piece or pieces documenting what happened, why, and the way forward that we've only been able to skim in this brief conversation. Let me now, with great pleasure, hand over to Nirupama. I, at one point in our conversation, mentioned parachute journalists. Now, Nirupama is one who's anything but a parachute journalist. She's been covering, she's been visiting, and trying to understand the nuances, the complexities of Sri Lanka, its polity and governance, and in all other facets. So it will be very interesting to see, after we four Sri Lankans have talked about among ourselves, what your perspectives are, Nirupama. Over to you, and thank you, audience. Thank you, speakers. That's it from me.
Thank you, Nalika. Thank you so much. Yeah, definitely not a parachute journalist. They really have to throw me out of a country. I stick around so long. So, yeah, thanks a lot to all the panelists, to Malan, to Rehana, and Amita for their really excellent presentations. In many ways, somebody said, what are the lessons for the rest of the countries in South Asia? And I think in many ways, what the Janata Aragalia did was to remind the rest of us in South Asia about the potency of people's power, of the strength of protest. So that is a silver lining in a sense to all the stuff that has happened in Sri Lanka, because we have kind of in most parts of South Asia, protests are no longer, we don't protest at all for many things. And the farmers' protest in India last year was a real departure in a sense. And for some time, I thought that the Aragalia might have taken inspiration from that. However, I think what's happening in Iran now, what's happening in Afghanistan now, they could not have been untouched by what they saw in Sri Lanka. Although in Iran, of course, it's been happening every now and then. So what I will do now is to, I have a few comments about India's role over the last few months in Sri Lanka. And I just want to say that, most Sri Lankans, they remember or know about India's intervention in the ethnic conflict. This is the first thing that comes to mind: arms training of the Tamil militants and the presence of the IPKF, the Indian Army, in Sri Lanka. And obviously, there's a longer history to India's intervention at the time. But if I, at the risk of putting it very simplistically and in general terms, I think since 1983, there is a suspicion about what India's intents are vis-a-vis Sri Lanka. I think both among the Sinhalese as well as over time among the Tamil people. But even without that intervention, I think a small country of 21 million or so is bound to have existential concerns about a big neighbor, 1.5 billion, huge economy next door. So when India did what it had never done before in recent history, at least in anybody's memory, that in the shortest of time periods, just put together an assistance package in various forms of about 4 billion. There were questions in Sri Lanka, and this was the first thing I heard when I landed in on the 8th of April, just a day before the Gulf Face protest began. What is India getting in return or taking in return? And is it going to, is India actually helping the Rajapaksa regime to stay on? And we saw these fears in one form or the other, these concerns, starting even from before the Gulf Face protest from February onwards. And the High Commission was constantly putting out, I think they put out a record number of denials in the last 6 or 8 months. But imagine the opposite, India not doing anything. Sri Lanka's biggest neighbor, the most proximate neighbor, just folding its hands, sitting there and saying, no, we're not going to help now. So I think that would have been a real travesty. It would have been far worse. And it would have provoked worse sentiments in a country with whom India otherwise has excellent people-to-people ties. And I think it was, in a way, India's duty to have helped as a neighbor, and I'm glad they did that. So yes, I mean, it does seem that Delhi did get a few things in return, which confirms the old adage that there is no such thing as a free lunch, especially not in the realm of international relations. So India got, for instance, an agreement to develop the Trincomalee Trank Farm, which has been hanging since 2002. And you could say, I mean, people would say, no, this is not exactly for that. And, you know, we have been negotiating that for so many months, and it just came through at the right time and all that. But whatever it was, it came through at that time, precisely at that time. So I do see it as a quid pro quo. And the biggest tycoon, the biggest business industrialist in India now, also this briefly the second richest man in the world, got a contract to set up a wind farm in the northwest coast. And an Indian-funded project displaced a Chinese-funded Chinese project in the 3 islands north of Jaffna. There will also be other Indian investments, perhaps in the IT or pharma sector, and these are all of importance to India, especially, you know, with the whole Indo-Pacific and the Indian Ocean region heating up. This is all going to be, contentious. It's going to be of strategic importance to India. What Sri Lanka agrees to, what it does not agree to, is all going to come up, I'm sure, in the next few months. And just as it was believed that, you know, India-Sri Lanka relations had entered a new chapter, you know, they had, you know, now a new era. There was this episode of a Chinese military ship docking at Hambantota. And, you know, so all things put together from me to this audience here, I just put together a few takeaways on India-Sri Lanka relations from the last 6 months. One is that as a small country next to a large country, which is an economic powerhouse, Sri Lanka is bound to feel insecure about India, whatever India does. And it will continue to balance its foreign policy, leverage its location in the Indian Ocean to get the best out of its neighbor and its neighbor's rivals. And this is going to be a point of tension in our relations for the foreseeable future. It's going to be a source of tension. One of the sources of this insecurity, I mean, it's been there for a long time, it's not new, is to do with Tamil Nadu and the links to Tamil politics in Sri Lanka, to the Tamil ethnic question, to the Tamil question. but Tamil Nadu is not going away, and the Tamils of Sri Lanka are not going away. So, Marlon, Rehana, and Amita have made such wonderful presentations, and they are of a new generation of Sri Lankans. And what my I don't know if it's an appeal or a plea or whatever you call it, is that, if the younger generation of Sri Lankans can signal to the political leadership that this is something that has to be resolved to the satisfaction of all communities. I mean, that is one less issue in India-Sri Lanka relations. I might be simplifying this more than I should, but we talked about voter education, how voters should, act democratically, think democratically, and they've not voted in the right people. You can say that about about a lot of other countries in the region. And identity is everything now. Identity, vote in democracies. You've seen that in Italy. You've seen that in Sweden. Far right, Sweden. Who would have thought? So identity is being used in a way by politicians that we haven't seen before, and that is and that goes to the to the heart of how people voted in Sri Lanka. So the thing is, I think without the Tamil question being resolved, I think we are going to not see Sri Lanka come out of entirely out of, the economic crisis may be solved, and Sri Lanka was better off than most countries in the 70s and in the early part of the 80s. So it's possible, but it won't be entirely resolved, I think. And if Sri Lanka were to do that, I would think it would be a great example for the rest of us. It would set examples in India. It would set examples in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, of how to live together, how to manage pluralism, how to manage diversity. I mean, India used to be big at this, but we are not anymore. Everywhere minorities are under siege, and this is something that, as a region, we have to learn to address. For Sri Lanka, I mean, if India feels its if India feels its security is being deliberately compromised or undermined by Sri Lankan foreign policy, I think India will take steps to, in its own interests. At least could be a range of, there are a range of options available to states, and this is what they do. Knowing the situation, I would say that India must provide as much transparency in its dealings with Sri Lanka, so that I wouldn't say no suspicion but would ever arise, but at least you reduce that the sources of tension as much as possible about alleged secret agreements between Delhi and Colombo, or between Colombo and private entities in India, whose interests for which Delhi may or may not be shilling for. So, and Sri Lankans, I'm so, it's so heartening that Sri Lankans played a crucial part in revealing the, behind the scenes dealings in the Adani wind farm deal. And hopefully more questions will be asked on the Indian side too. And I hope that will happen. I think going forward, this is the last thing that I want to say, that the most important thing going in favor of both countries are the people-to-people ties between these two countries. These are ties that do not exist between, for instance, India and China, or between Sri Lanka and China. But we take each other, Indians and Sri Lankans, or India and Sri Lanka, take each other for granted in so many ways. And after all these years, I think we must be better able to understand each other's concerns. And, there's so much more communication. There's so many more ways of communicating, but it seems that we are still stuck in past formulations, past stereotypes. And I think we must try and connect more as people to people, more in a more structured way. Yes, I mean, tourists go, tourists come. There's a lot of kinship ties between the two countries. But if we can take this forward in a more structured way, have collaboration, more structured collaborations, for instance, media collaborations, I think those ideas must be explored. So I will, that's what I have to say. And thanks a lot for listening to me. It was really a great presentation from all of you. And I'm really happy to have taken part in it. Thanks.
Thank you,
so much.
Nirupama. Your cross-border experience has always amazed me, actually. And the fact that you've been covering Sri Lanka since 95, being based there. I mean, since 95, and you've been also based there. The insights you've given at the moment, I think has been very valuable for all of us. And also our brothers and sisters who are listening from Sri Lanka too. It's really, I've listened to you this week once more in a cross-border this thing. And every time I learn so much hearing from you, your rich experience and your writings and your insights, especially being based in Sri Lanka, is very valuable. Thank you.
Thank you, Namrata.
The closing part, I think it was excellent. And frankly speaking, we've been now here virtually sitting and listening to each other for more than 2.5 hours. And it's because all of you great speakers and moderated by Nalaka, you've really been able to bring out lots of key points on the issue of rebuilding Sri Lanka, reforms or revolution. I think this is in the mind of people who know Sri Lanka, who know South Asia, and it's of global interest at the moment. Lots of intake has come from each one of you, and it'll not be justification for me to even wrap up a little bit. But what I want to say is I want to thank everyone for Nalaka's excellent moderation and his questioning, which brought out lots of nuances from all three of our main speakers, Rehana, Amita, and Marlon. And of course, Nirupama captured everything and put her insight of the work she's been doing in Sri Lanka and her thoughts about it also. Thank you very much. I also want to apologize for the Sri Lankan speakers whose names I don't think I pronounced properly. So forgive the Nepali tongue on that. I'll try my best next time. And having said that, I once more want to thank all of you for making this Sapan event such a wonderful experience. And I want to thank everybody who's been listening to us here and also on Facebook Live. There have been so many questions. Unfortunately, each of them could not be answered, but I think Nalaka again summarized quite a few of them. And now, having said that, I want to move on to Ekta to take over, wrap up, and end the session. Ekta from Sapan.
Thank you, Namrata, and thank you to all our speakers and to our wonderful moderator, Nalaka. Amazing questions, amazing insights. We've all of us have learned so much about the situation from all of you who are insiders, and such intelligent points of view that have been presented today. I think it's a wake up for everybody in South Asia, and it's not just applicable to Sri Lanka at this point in time. Thank you, all of you. I am requesting everyone to leave feedback about this event. I'm going to share the link in the chat group as well as on Facebook. Your suggestions and your feedback helps us grow. Sapan is a collective. We're all in this together. We're all volunteers behind the scenes. And everything that you suggest, we do take it seriously, and we do try to implement it as, whenever the time is right. So thank you, everybody. I'm going to be switching off the Facebook Live now. Thank you all for being here, and please do stay on for more discussions after the Facebook Live goes on. Thank you.